the website.
Welcome to the Compliance.Network Podcast, your compliance community. Since 2014, we've been helping financial services companies understand and follow the rules that govern the industry. Whether you're nearby or across the globe, we're here for you. Let's jump into the latest trends, tips, and updates in the ever-evolving world of regulatory compliance.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Compliance.Network Podcast. I'm your co-host, Jeremy Wolf, joined by, of course, your host, Kevin Rowe. Kevin, good to see you.
Hey, Jeremy, good to see you as well.
Yeah, man. Yeah. And thanks, as always, to our listeners for tuning in. We are going to get into it today. We're going to do some myth busting. Are you ready to bust some myths, Kevin?
Yeah, with it being so close to Halloween, it makes sense for us to bust out the myth busters, if you will. Let's do it.
All right. So myth number one.
Sure.
Compliance is just paperwork.
Yes.
Is it now?
It is not. If it were, perhaps there wouldn't be a need for the types of services that we offer with the Compliance Network. Just the reality of it is that compliance is much more than just checking the boxes. I know that there's been a lot of driving towards a checklist, and the checklist is really good. However, what's behind that checklist or checking those boxes is what your regulator or primary designated examining authority, the DEA, would require for you to provide. Obviously, there are books and records requirements that each broker-dealer and investment advisor must adhere to. And so a part of your checklist should also be the records that support those checklists. This is very important because proactively managing it and identifying these types of risks within your process will help protect your firm from legal and regulatory financial challenges.
How do you recommend that firms shift their mindset from this idea of checking boxes, right, and just getting through the things that they need to do from a compliance standpoint to actively managing the risk?
The big thing you would have to do is identify your risks, look at each segment of your business, look at where your risks are. So you say, okay, I don't know how to identify my risks. Your challenge there is that everything in front of you or everything that makes up your business has some component of risk, whether it's the type of clients that you solicit to do business with, or even the types of products that you solicit your clients to purchase, and the people you hire, your policies and procedures. So there's various categories of risks or where risk can be assigned, and each of those categories within your policies and procedures should be identified as well.
What are maybe let's get a little bit more specific, right? What are some of the more specific risks that firms, from your experience in dealing with clients, that firms typically overlook when they're treating compliance as just checking boxes, as mere paperwork?
Yes, the biggest risk you face is lack of books and records. You have a supervisory review risk within your FINRA framework and also the investment advisory framework. So that the way that the regulations were written was to make someone responsible. And so because someone's responsible, then obviously the person who is serving as a compliance officer or even a principal of a firm, you've got to be able to demonstrate that you're aware of what's happening inside of your business and that you're accounting for these types of risks. I will say that the biggest risks right now being driven by the SEC, by FINRA, and by each of the different states are your conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest, whether you have an outside business activity or you have an outside brokerage account, these are potential conflicts of interest for your clients, and your clients have a right to know this information. So it's really a focus driven on transparency. So I would definitely encourage everyone who's in this field to start with the basics.
Well, that's a good tip. That actually is a perfect segue into the next question I have. So obviously larger organizations, they have more priority over these compliance issues, right? And oftentimes they have people within the organization that handle this type of stuff. So it's a little bit easier. What about smaller firms, right, that don't have a compliance team internally? How do they prioritize these top risks without overextending resources? Because obviously time is the biggest resource for all of us. And I'm thinking for more of the smaller entities, right? How do they get in there and take care of this and prioritize everything in the most effective way possible?
I think the bigger thing is that if you need additional resources, you've got to prioritize resources. You can present compliance challenges and simply tell your regulator, "Hey, I'm sorry, but I just don't have the
I don't have
resources
to
to do
research.
this."
They don't,
So,
they don't care about that.
yeah, no,
They'll just give you a lot of
that
fines and
that's
train
the
more of your
least of their
resources.
concerns.
Yeah.
Absolutely, that's the least of their concerns. You, as the business owner, must set the compliance tone at the top, and that includes setting aside a budget for your adherence to the rules. It's going to pay dividends. One of the bigger issues is that if your firm does fall short of the regulatory expectations, there's always that reputational risk that goes along with that.
Sure.
FINRA and the SEC have requirements for disclosure, apparent failures, and those apparent failures will have varying degrees of risk on your reputation. Obviously, some of the bigger risk items such as conflict of interest, AML, which I will go into here shortly, and myth number 2 is those items should obviously be at the top of your priority.
You hear that, everyone? Compliance is not just paperwork. Don't just check off the boxes. Actively manage your risk. It will pay dividends, as the master says. Okay, so myth 2, you touched upon it. Only big firms need anti-money laundering AML systems in place.
That's a huge myth. One of the bigger concerns when the regulatory structure was updated in 2006 was that the smaller firms would now have to play on the same field and have the same services and systems that the larger firms have. And as you can imagine, smaller firms were slow to adopt these transaction monitoring systems for whatever reason, whether it was cost restraints or I just don't have that many clients. Not having clients or a lot of volume may be the only thing that will save you from having an AML system. My thought is that if you have 250 or more accounts, that's when you start looking for monitoring of your transactions and surveillance for AML. One of the bigger things that occurred in the industry was FINRA's notice to members, or notices as they call them now, 1918, which lays out the AML red flags that FINRA believes that its members should be identifying in its normal course of business. Notice 1918 is not required to be adopted in its entirety. So it's very important that you use that tool from the regulator, but also make sure that it fits your business.
This is interesting. So how do firms, or how are they expected to keep up with all these regulations? Are there, like you just touched upon one, in terms of AML requirements, are there any other ones that smaller firms might not be aware of that should be addressed immediately? Because I can imagine that keeping up with all this compliance, like how does a firm go about doing that and make sure that you're not missing anything? So it seems like it's a lot of stuff to keep up with.
Absolutely. And I would venture out to say here, in the sake of sounding redundant, is resources, making sure that your team has the proper resources. It's not uncommon now. For example, you have smaller firms or medium-sized firms or firms that just fit a basic model that may outsource their compliance to companies that have the resources to devote to reviewing their program. However, even in a situation where there's a full-time CCO in-house, it's not uncommon now to have certain reviews, such as off-channel communications, which the Compliance.Network offers as an example of the types of reviews that would help eliminate or alleviate resource pressures for internal staff. So there's various ways that firms can go about meeting their regulatory requirements. The biggest deal here, or the biggest takeaway, is that you have to review what's required and to assign the appropriate resources based on your risk as a firm.
What if you don't, right? What are some of the consequences? Let's say, just say for smaller firms or even larger firms, right? Like they just neglect something. Maybe it wasn't intentional. It was a new thing that came out and they just weren't up to speed with it, and they overlooked something and they weren't in compliance for AML. What are some of the consequences that firms can face?
Sure. Consequences, I hate to sound cliche here, but I'll use the same language as our regulators, which is up to expulsion, which means that your firm can be removed, have its membership revoked, its principals can be sanctioned and barred. As a former examiner of having the privilege to work for our regulator, the amount of resources and time and training that they put into the examination team and staff, it's impressive because they're responsible for reviewing this information and ensuring and protecting the markets and clients. So if you had the privilege like I did to see the amount of resources that the regulator puts towards ensuring market integrity and client protection, then you would understand the reason why you've got to prioritize compliance in your firm.
I've used this phrase many times before, and I'll use it again. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Always.
Yeah, 100%.
What are some of the common red flags? I know you have a background as a regulator, so you have a unique perspective on this. What are some of the common red flags that regulators typically look for when they're assessing AML compliance in firms?
Oh, wow. What are you risk ranking your customers?
Or I'm sorry, risk.
Are
what
you
is it?
risk ranking or risk scoring
ranking.
your customers? Okay. Yes. So that's, does this person pose, what is their specific AML risk or ML risk? What are the money laundering risks associated with a particular customer? Are they located in a high risk jurisdiction? And keeping in mind that there are high intensity drug trafficking zones designated in the United States, as well as high designated crime areas that are designated in the United States, not just from an international standpoint, but where are they located, period, whether it's international or within the United States itself. That'll help drive your understanding of your business and your business model and the types of clients and risks that you're willing to assume. Most firms will not take on more risk appetite or have a higher risk appetite than what their resources will allow for them to have. If they do, that's where you get into challenges with reasonably designed AML programs, which is a part of the rule issued by FinCEN.
How can firms evaluate? Time for some pro tips here, right? Little nuggets are going to give out here. What's the evaluating which AML software would be right for a business, or bringing on part-time consultants or people such as yourself to help with these types of issues from a compliance standpoint?
Yeah, it's imperative. You don't want to go out and find a system that may or may not meet the regulatory requirements. There's a lot of different vendors out there. We here at the Compliance Network, we work with particular vendors. Some of our vendors obviously have demonstrated that they meet the regulatory requirements, and so we may recommend them. A person in the industry, I'll avoid conflicts of interest here myself without naming them. However, I would suggest that if you're a smaller firm, that FINRA has a small firms resource page. There is information there to guiding you towards locating resources. And then also you have various companies such as myself that can assist with that type of review and due diligence, because it is a lot of work and it's a project, right? Implementing a new system requires resources and project plans and time frames and implementation deadlines. Systems only as good as is how it's implemented. And so here at the Compliance Network, we have a team and staff that can assist with that type of review. Before we move on to our next myth, I would like to just say that the bigger goal of your compliance and from an AML standpoint is to understand your overall risks, and then how you can, and your resources, and then how you can automate some of those resources along the way.
Yeah, it sounds to me like if you're going to get into this space, the compliance component has to be baked into the cake of your business plan. They have to have resources and have everything set up and allocated from the very beginning to make sure this stuff is being managed properly.
Absolutely. It's a part of your requirements to even gain membership or even to acquire an existing firm, is that you have to demonstrate that you have the knowledge with the registration requirements, but then also understanding and resources in place to monitor your business.
Myth number 3, compliance is only needed when there's a problem. Go.
Yeah, that's typically when we get the call.
Fix the problem. Let's go.
Exactly. After things have already gone past a certain point, but there are mitigation and remediation items available. So if you are at that point, we do encourage you to reach out to a professional that can help you or guide you through that process. Waiting until there's a problem to fast track a change or to get to an adherence, again, that reputational damage, financial penalties issued for firms, sanctions, We've seen one of the bigger items that regulators do is that if you're so bad off, that they will require that you retain compliance professionals to assist you with updating or revising or amending your program to fit the regulatory requirements. So that's not atypical as a penalty from the regulator. It is one of the steeper ones because now they're telling you that, hey, your people there aren't up to speed on what needs to get done. So I think naturally, the best thing you should do is just schedule your reviews, address any gaps before it turns into a problem. One way to identify, and this is a really good arrow for your quiver, is pay attention to the FINRA and the SEC. They offer different educational opportunities, webinars, continuing education. Typically, the topics that they're discussing are going to be the topics that are going to be relevant to ensuring that you have the compliance program in place for those particular areas. Each year, FINRA and the SEC also issues its examination priorities. That's a good place for you or reference as well. Just for those that have been around for as long as I have been, you can remember when for example, the FINRA examination priorities for, let's say, 2007 was probably a 5 or 6 page PDF. Now there's an entire website with a directory with the ins and outs and every possible topic of every possible business line that you may conduct. You definitely want to use that as a guide to help identify where these kind of lesser known compliance reviews may occur.
What are some common warning signs that firms might see before an issue arises? Is there anything to look for? Any hot spots that can identify the water before it starts to boil over?
It's got to be proactive. A lot of times you won't know the regulator's looking into something until you get that letter and they're requesting books and records. And by then it's too late, right? And basically at that point, you're doing damage control. So the best thing you can do is be proactive in addressing the different areas, using the resources that I just mentioned to try to devise yourself a strategy to maintain throughout an examination or possible examination that hasn't even been announced yet. But I would say that most firms are aware, whether they're on a cycle examination, a routine cycle, whether you're on a 1, 2, or 3 year. Obviously, if you're in a 1 year examination review cycle with any regulator, that means that you have a lot of challenges, meaning that you probably operate a high risk business or you've demonstrated compliance deficiencies to a degree that the regulator no longer wants to wait a year or two. Typically, firms of medium risk may be on a 2 year, and then those that have demonstrated proficiencies tend to have a more of a lax review period.
How does ongoing compliance help firms to maintain a positive reputation and instill client trust?
One, you stay out of the news. You don't want to you don't want to be the subject of one of those articles where it's talking about your compliance failures or deficiencies. It's going to happen. It's just the course of doing business. You can put all resources towards your compliance program. There's still going to be some challenges in any particular program. I don't want to term it as the cost of doing business, because that would obviously take away from the importance that our regulators and emphasis on rule adherence. So I don't want to do that. However, it is a part of doing business, is that there's a lot to know. And so the more resources and experts, if you will, that you can bring to the table to help you would be better for everyone. So it's an uphill fight.
Before we wrap up this segment, let's give a couple of actionable tips for follow-up. So for a firm that's looking to, again, going back to what you said about checking boxes versus putting systems in place and really taking this as operating protocol, for a firm that's looking to turn compliance into a strength, what cultural or operational shifts can help a business to make that change?
Look at the top. Look at your board of directors, your owners, your executive committees. Are they setting the tone for compliance? The regulatory expectation is that they are. And so every business opportunity, business strategy, as a part of your new business or of your venture, you want to ensure that you review not only the way that you can become profitable, but also the risk involved in that particular business, and then how your compliance team is able to, one, supervise that you're following the rules related to that business, and then also ensure that you identify 2 or 3 core risk items in your firm and process or product, and address those items and work your way from there.
So mindset is everything in life and in business. How can
and compliance?
So it naturally extends to that. How can compliance be framed as an investment rather than a cost to a firm's bottom line? Because again, if you're looking at it as just an expense, you're more likely to check the boxes and not take it seriously like it needs to be. So how could a business frame this as more an investment in the business rather than just a simple expense or a cost?
Investment is tough because you're investing in yourself and your business. So that's the top priority. I view compliance more so as an insurance to mitigate against some of life's natural, or businesses, in this case, broker dealer, investment advisor, natural disasters, end quote. Simply put, there's always going to be something. There are no insurances or guarantees that having the best is always going to be it. It's just the way that this field works. However, you may not have it all the way, but as long as you have a majority of the components, that's what the regulator's looking for, is that you considered out of 10 things, at least 7 to 8 of those things, and the 2 or 3 that you may have missed, how impactful they are to market integrity and client protection, right? Investor protection. There's a lot to know in this field. There's always going to be something changing. There's going to be different methodologies to get to the end. But ultimately, you just want to make sure that you're addressing the risks in each area, and that'll help you beat our first myth of just paperwork.
And lastly, before we wrap up here, I want you to pull out your crystal ball, Kevin. It's crystal ball time. What's the future hold for compliance? What does it look like for firms of all sizes?
Technology, how you leverage technology.
AI?
Yeah, definitely. I believe that you're always going to have a component that's going to require the designation of a physical human. I believe that with the advances in technologies, the expectation of regulatory bodies and entities will increase. Something that would seem to take a very long time for someone to review manually, or even to use an alert-based system. My expectation is that with technology grows, the expectation grows. So the more that you can be transparent, the more that you can identify your conflicts of interest and let that information be known, I believe that it's going to put larger emphasis on what your outputs are. So your books and records will be more thorough because now you've implemented an AI solution to aggregate and put more speedier reviews in place. So my thought is that it'll just get bigger. What your expectations or what you're required to adhere to me will just grow from a regulatory expectation standpoint.
Makes perfect sense. All right, that's a good place to end. Thanks everyone for tuning in. If you have any feedback or comments, or there's any other topics that you'd like to discuss, put it in the comments and we'll get into it in a future episode. Everyone, again, thanks for tuning in, and we will catch you all in the next episode, the Compliance Network Podcast. Everyone take care. Have a great day.
Thank you for tuning in to the Compliance Network Podcast. We hope you found today's episode valuable. Until next time, you may find our community on social media at Compliance.Network. We are on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook for more insights and observations.